great hall of Ironvale Keep was burning, not with fire, with light. 400 candles along every wall, every table, every carved stone arch, flooding the room with a gold so warm and full it looked like the sun had decided to stay indoors for the evening. The ceremonial drums were already running, deep and low, the kind of sound you don't just hear. You feel it move through the stone floor and up through the soles of your feet and settle somewhere behind your ribs where it pulses like a second heartbeat. And the people, the Ironvale Pack at full celebration, were filling every corner of that hall with the specific, unquestioning joy of a people who believe that their world is solid and permanent and theirs. Aelor Ironvale sat at the head of it all, gold-eyed, broad-shouldered. Dressed in deep midnight black with the silver Ironvale crest at his collar, because he was the kind of man who understood, instinctively, that a room crowded with power still needed someone at the center of it to look as though power had always felt natural to him. And it did. It always had. He was laughing at something the woman beside him had just said, the corner of his mouth lifting in that particular way, the genuinely amused one, the one that belonged only to a man who has never once spent a full night wondering whether he deserved the room he was standing in. The woman beside him was Soraya Blackthorn. She was dressed in red. Not because she had to be, but because she understood that deliberate choices read as confidence from across a crowded room. Her laughter was perfectly placed, not too loud to seem eager, not too soft to go unnoticed, just right, landing exactly where she wanted it to land, which was in the space that had belonged to someone else for 3 years. We are not in the Great Hall. We are in the East Corridor, the cold one, the quiet one, the one that smells of old stone and the particular kind of silence that only lives in places where no one has ever come to perform anything for anyone. There are no candles here. The only light presses in through thin gaps in the stone from the warmth of the hall beyond, thin gold lines across the floor, like a promise the rest of the world is keeping somewhere else. A woman stands in that near dark, completely still. She's dark-haired, dressed in traveling silver, not ceremonial, not formal. Just the silver of someone who has already made a decision about where she is going and dressed for the journey, not the farewell. Under one arm she carries a leather document case. Against her other shoulder, sleeping with the boneless, complete trust of a child who has never once been given a reason to feel unsafe, is a small girl wrapped in a traveling blanket, so carefully that only her face shows. The woman is not running. She is not crying. She is walking. One step, and then the next, toward the side gate at the far end of the corridor. The one that opens onto the back road, the one that leads west into the dark and the cold and the clean, open air of a life she has spent 18 days quietly building on the other side of everything she has known. Her name is Elira Silvercrest. She is the Luna of the Ironvale Pack. Aelor Ironvale's bonded mate, the woman who has stood at his right hand at every formal gathering for 3 years, gracious and quiet and, to most eyes in this pack, a little unremarkable. The kind of woman you notice and then forget. The kind who never pushes toward the center of any room. They were wrong about her, every single one of them, but she spent 3 years making sure they would be. Through the stone walls at her back, the drums roll on. The feast burns gold through every window of the keep. 400 candles, still going. The laughter of 400 people celebrating a world they believe is exactly as solid as it has always been. Aelor Ironvale does not know that the woman who built his world is walking out of it right now through the East Corridor. He does not know she is carrying his greatest secret sleeping against her shoulder. He does not know that the alliances he has been credited with for 3 years are about to begin unraveling, quietly, from the inside, because the person who actually maintained them is no longer in the building and will not be coming back. By the time he reaches for her in the morning, she will already be beyond the reach of every version of a life that required her to be invisible inside it, just to survive it. He will understand soon enough. But first, you need to go back, 3 years back, because before you can feel the full weight of this corridor, before you can stand here in the dark and understand what it cost her to walk through this gate, you need to understand what she is leaving behind, and what it cost her to love it 3 years earlier. The document hall in Ironvale Keep was not a grand room. It was a practical one. Long shelving units, scroll racks, flat work tables designed for spreading maps without anything slipping, and the permanent smell of old parchment and wax seals that never quite cleared no matter how the seasons shifted. It was the kind of room that attracted serious people, because it had nothing else to offer. No views, no warmth, no decoration, just the work. Elira Silvercrest was a serious person. She had arrived at Ironvale Keep 12 days earlier as a territorial records consultant, hired to audit a disputed boundary claim between Ironvale and the neighboring Darkmoor Pack. She was 23 years old. She was not from a powerful family. Her father had been a scholar who spent his life collecting land histories and treaty records, and she had grown up surrounded by maps the way other children grew up surrounded by toys. She had ink-stained fingers and the quiet of someone who had discovered, at a young age, and without any particular sadness, that rooms paid more attention to you when you did not demand it of them. It was past midnight. She had been in this room for 3 consecutive late sessions, and would need at least 1 more. 3 territorial maps were spread across the central table: the original boundary survey, the contested amended version filed 6 years ago, and a 3rd document that the rest of the audit team had glanced at, filed as a duplicate, and moved past. It was not a duplicate. Elira had been cross-referencing it against the other 2 for the better part of an hour. She was close to finding the specific discrepancy that would explain why the eastern boundary had shifted by 2 degrees, with no formal correction anywhere in the official record. Someone had changed something. They had changed it carefully, and they had counted on no one being the kind of person who kept all 3 versions open at once. She was that kind of person. She was so absorbed in the 3rd map that she didn't hear the door open. What she heard was a voice, direct, without ceremony. "Why do you have all 3 versions open at once?" She looked up. Aelor Ironvale was already the alpha king of the Ironvale Pack by the time he walked into that document hall. He was already everything the Pack credited him with: commanding, certain, the kind of physical presence that made rooms quietly adjust around him rather than the other way around. He was dressed in his daily wear, no ceremony to it, and he was looking at the 3 maps with the direct, entirely genuine attention of a man who had asked a question because he actually wanted the answer. Not performing curiosity, not managing an impression, actually curious. Elira had been around enough powerful people by then to know the difference between those 2 things. She had also learned, very early, not to confuse them. She explained. The discrepancy, the 6-year gap. The way the 3rd document, the supposedly duplicate one, actually contained the original measurement that everyone else had filed as superseded, but which, when compared carefully against the amended version, showed clear signs of having been altered after the fact. Not recently. Years ago. Quietly. Aylor pulled the chair on the other side of the table and sat down. Not to stand over the information and direct it. Not to position himself above the work. He sat across from her, the way you sit across from someone you are actually going to listen to, and he said, "Walk me through it." She walked him through it. He asked questions, specific, sequential questions, the kind that prove the person asking them has absorbed the previous answer before forming the next one. He did not redirect her reasoning toward his own knowledge. He did not reframe her findings through his own authority. He simply sat in the candlelight with both hands flat on the table and learned from her. They were in that room for 2 hours. Somewhere in the middle of the second hour, Elira Silvercrest understood that she was in trouble. Not dangerous trouble. The quieter kind. The kind you get into when you encounter something you did not expect and find, with some alarm, that you have no resistance to it whatsoever. The man across from her was not performing interest in her mind. He was genuinely interested in her mind, and in her experience. That was both the rarest thing a person could turn out to be and the most disarming. She told herself it was professional admiration. She kept telling herself that for about 3 weeks. He asked her to stay on after the audit was complete. Not in a formal role, since the Pack Council had not yet built a place for someone with her expertise, but as a working extension of the Alpha's correspondence and territorial review. She said yes, with the reasonable certainty of a woman who knows when something is worth staying for. 3 months later, he asked her to be his Luna. Not in the council chamber, not with the pack assembled. In the document hall where they had met, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, pale winter light falling through the narrow windows, a boundary map still open on the table between them, as if neither of them had thought to put it away. He was looking at her in the way of someone who has turned around and found something standing there that they had not known was missing and cannot now imagine being without. She said yes before he finished asking. She would think about that. Much later. In a quiet room, long after everything else had changed, and she would not regret the yes. She would only grieve the version of him that had made it so effortless to give. The early months of the bond were everything the document hall had promised. He sat beside her work. He wanted to understand it, not just receive the benefit of it, but understand it. How she thought. Why she arrived at the conclusions she did. What the working process looked like before the finished thing appeared. He made room for her mind in every room they shared. Not by moving other things aside with deliberate effort, but the way you make room for something that belongs there and always should have. There was a morning she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She was at her desk before dawn, deep in a treaty correspondence that needed to reach the morning dispatch. Cold tea sat untouched at her elbow. The keep was still sleeping. The light was early grey, the particular grey of a morning that hasn't decided yet what kind of day it intends to be. The door opened without a knock. Aylor came in, carrying 2 cups of hot tea. He set one beside her inkwell without a word. He did not ask if she needed anything. He did not wait for acknowledgement. He sat down across from her, picked up a council brief from the edge of the table, and began to read. For a full hour they worked in the same room, in complete, easy silence. He did not reach for her attention. He did not fill the quiet with conversation for the sake of filling it. He simply wanted to be in the room where she was working, and she let him. And it was enough for both of them. That was the moment she decided. Not with ceremony. Not with a declaration she made to herself or anyone else. just a quiet, complete, entirely private settling of certainty. This is the person I am going to choose. Every single day. This one, starting now and without any planned end. She meant it. She would spend the next 3 years slowly, and then all at once, learning that the man who sat across from her in that morning light was not entirely the same man she ended up living beside. But she did not know that yet. And so, she loved him. Without reservation. The way you love something you have chosen completely and have no reason yet to doubt. The pack received her carefully. The Elder Council had precise ideas about what a Luna should look and sound like, and Elira's quietness was initially read as a kind of limitation, a softness they could work around. They were wrong about that, but understanding would come slowly, and by the time it arrived, the cost of their misreading would have compounded in ways none of them had been watching closely enough to notice, including Aelor, including, for a while still, Elira herself. 1 year into their bond, Elira Silvercrest had become something the Ironvale pack did not have a name for. She performed the Luna role that the pack expected. She attended the gatherings. She wore the silver. She said the right things at the right moments, smiled graciously at the right people, and occupied the warm and unremarkable space that had been designated for the woman beside the Alpha. She was good at it. Better than good. She had the particular talent of someone who understands a room completely without needing the room to understand her back. But alongside the visible role, a second thing had grown, invisible to almost everyone who thought they were paying attention. Every alliance letter that went out under Aelor's seal was drafted at her desk first. Every council brief was built in her voice and presented with his name on it. Every territorial claim was reviewed, shaped, and often entirely reframed by her thinking before it ever reached the formal table. She maintained the Keep's household correspondence. She managed the diplomatic archive. She raised Ava, born in their 2nd year together, with the same patient, unhurried attention her own father had given her. She had become the architecture beneath everything Aelor was credited with, and the structure had no interest in naming its own foundations. The clearest example of this came in the 3rd season of their bond, with what the Council would later celebrate as the Darkmoor Peace. The Darkmoor Pack had been a source of border conflict for over a decade. 2 formal peace summits had collapsed. The accumulated grievance between the packs ran deep enough that no single negotiation could cross it head-on. Every time representatives sat down at a formal table, every old wound opened at once, and what should have been a forward conversation became a full inventory of historical wrongs. Elira did not try to cross the grievance directly. She identified, early in her reading of the Darkmoor correspondence files, that the pack's formal representatives were not the people who actually made decisions. They were the people who announced decisions. The thinking happened elsewhere. And she found, through careful reading of the secondary communications, where it happened. She began corresponding with Virel Darkmoor, the Luna of the rival pack, a woman the Ironvale Council had dismissed entirely because she held no formal alpha authority and didn't sit at any negotiating table. She was considered politically irrelevant. Elira recognized immediately that this was a gift. Virel knew where every actual concession the Darkmoor pack could accept was buried, because she lived with the consequences of all those decisions every day. She knew which elders were exhausted by the conflict and which ones needed it for their standing. She knew which territorial demands were posturing and which ones were the real thing. She knew which insults had never been formally named, but had never, in 20 years, been forgotten. 3 seasons of letters. Careful, patient, entirely below the formal diplomatic surface. Elira built trust between two Lunars, letter by letter, season by season, until their alphas could sit down and formally agree to what had already been quietly settled. By the time Aelor took his seat at the final summit table, the framework was complete. The concessions were agreed. The resistance was already gone. He was walking through a door that had been unlocked from the inside months before he approached it. The council called it his finest diplomatic achievement. At the formal celebration session, Elder Zorian looked across the table at Aelor and said with genuine admiration, "The strategy here was extraordinary. Your instincts were remarkable." Aelor's hand was resting on the back of Illyra's chair. She was sitting beside him. She was right there. He accepted the commendation with his shoulders squared and his chin level. He said something appropriately modest about the strength of the Pack's position and the value of patience in territorial diplomacy. He did not correct them. Not in that room. Not in the corridor afterward. Not that evening in their chambers. Not the next morning. Not ever. Elira told herself it was a small thing. She had to believe it was small, because the alternative, that the man who once sat across from her and asked her to walk him through her thinking, who had made her feel that her intelligence was something worth understanding rather than simply receiving, was now comfortable accepting credit for that intelligence in a room where she was sitting right beside him, was a door she was not ready to open. She kept it closed. She filed the moment away in the small and quiet interior place where she was beginning to store everything she could not yet afford to examine directly. She did not notice, not then, how quickly that place was filling up. The pattern repeated, in different rooms at different tables, across different seasons. Her work, his name, the applause she heard from corridors where she stood with cold tea and no seat at the table. Each time she waited for the correction. Each time it did not come. Each time she told herself the same thing. It's small. He's busy. He doesn't realize. It will change. It did not change. It settled into habit, into the natural shape of things. And habit is harder to fight than intention, because habit doesn't feel like a choice anymore. In the second year of the bond, there was a second development, small enough to be easy to overlook, but one Elira would eventually understand as one of the most significant things that happened to her during those 3 years. A regular correspondence arrived from the Western Reach, standard border diplomacy, shared waterway questions along the territorial boundary, the kind of ongoing exchange that the Keep maintained with a dozen neighboring territories. The Lord there, Lorcan Stormvale, wrote careful and precise letters. But reading his third letter, Elira noticed something. He was responding not only to what she had written on the surface, but to the reasoning underneath it, to the structure of the argument before the argument arrived at its conclusion. He had found the thinking beneath the diplomatic language, and he had written back to it, directly, specifically, as if it were entirely natural to engage with what someone actually meant, rather than only what they had formally stated. She noticed this the way you notice something you are not ready to name yet, like recognizing a word in a language you didn't know you had begun to learn. She filed it. She went back to work. In the second year of their bond, Ava arrived. The birth was long. Aelor was in the room for all of it. When the nurse finally placed Ava in his arms, small, outraged at the whole situation, red-faced and furious in the way of all new arrivals who had not been asked permission, he held her with a reverence so complete it seemed to rearrange something in his face. The usual authority was gone. The easy certainty was gone. He was simply a man holding something genuinely fragile, understanding for the first time. in his body and not just his mind, that some things in the world are worth protecting above everything else. He looked across the room at Elira, exhausted, still, watching him hold their daughter with his full, unguarded face. His eyes were gold and entirely open. No performance behind them, no alpha king, no strategic thinking, no careful management of an impression. Just the real thing, a man and a feeling, and no distance between them. She would remember that look for the rest of her life. Not because it was false. It was the truest thing she ever saw on his face. She would remember it because it was the last time she saw his whole face with absolutely nothing hidden behind it. The first sign did not arrive as a confrontation. It arrived as an object, a silk ribbon, pale gold, the particular shade that Soraya Blackthorne favored in her gowns, a detail Elira knew because she made it her business to know every significant detail about every person in the pack who had ever directed sustained attention toward Aelor. She found the ribbon folded inside the inner pocket of his riding coat when she sent it to be cleaned. She held it for a moment. It was light, smooth, entirely ordinary looking, the way only the most damning things can be. She placed it back. She sent the coat down. She returned to her desk and sat in front of the treaty correspondence she had been writing, and stared at it for a long time without reading a word of it. Then she opened the first letter and began to write. This was her pattern. She had developed it over a long time, long before Aelor, because she had learned early that some truths revealed themselves more completely if you didn't force the shape of them too soon. She pulled the grief inward and placed it in the small, quiet interior space she kept for things she was not yet ready to examine. She did not confront. She did not demand explanations. She waited. What she did not understand yet was how much the waiting was accumulating, what it was doing to the small, quiet place where she kept storing things. The weeks that followed had the particular cruelty of a love that is not entirely false. One evening, Aelor returned from a week-long territorial meeting, 7 days away, and Elira had felt each one with a clarity she did not examine, and found her in the nursery, reading to Ava in the lamplight. Ava was nearly asleep. One small fist curled around the blanket's edge, breathing already gone slow and soft. Aelor stood in the doorway without announcing himself, just stood there. Then he crossed the room quietly and sat on the low edge of the bed beside her. Ava was between them. His hand found Elira's without looking, the automatic reach of someone whose hands have learned a geography by heart. He said her name, just her name, in the quiet voice he used when there was nothing strategic behind the sound, nothing to manage or perform. Just her name said simply, the way you say something that is also a complete sentence. She let herself believe it meant what she needed it to mean. That was the specific weight of a love that contains both real things and wrong things. The real moments do not cancel the wrong ones. They make the wrong ones heavier, because you keep seeing what the good version looks like, and you keep choosing, quietly, stubbornly, in the private dark of your own hoping, to believe it will eventually win. It did not win. On a Wednesday afternoon, 3 years into their bond, Elira went to Aelor's private study to retrieve routine council documents for the weekly dispatch. The document chest was never locked. She opened it. She found what she had come for. She also found, beneath a correctly filed treaty, slightly separated from the rest of the papers, just enough, a letter she had never seen. The ink was recent. The seal had been broken and refolded with care. She recognized Xavier Grimwood's handwriting before she reached the signature. She should have placed it back. She read it. It was written in the clean, functional language of an administrator who does not need to soften anything because the person reading already agrees with the conclusion. It outlined, in precise sequential language, a plan to use a procedural irregularity in the bonding documentation, an obscure technical gap of the kind that exists in old formal records and goes unnoticed for years because no one thinks to look for it, to dissolve Elira's lunar title before the next formal council season. The irregularity was apparently real, and Aelor had apparently known about it for 2 years. Soraya Blackthorn's name appeared in the 3rd paragraph. Her family's territories would significantly expand the Pack's formal authority in the southern reaches. The strategic value of the Blackthorn alliance was considerable. Elira's removal was, in this letter, simply the cost that Aelor had apparently decided he was prepared to pay. Attached, in Aelor's own handwriting, was his reply. 4 words. Begin the process quietly. She read those 4 words a second time. Not 3 words. 4. The last one, quietly, was worse than the others. It was the word of a man who had been holding this idea long enough to have developed specific preferences about how he wanted it to move. Not impulsive. Not a moment of weakness or poor judgment. A considered decision. A planned one. The quietly told her how long he had been thinking about the shape of her silence. She folded the letter back along its original creases, exactly as she had found it. She placed it back beneath the treaty. She closed the chest. She retrieved the documents she had come for. She stood in the room and took one long breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the kind of breath that is not about calming down. It is about deciding something. Then she walked to the window. Below, in the training yard, Aelor was moving through drills with his lieutenants. He was laughing at something Xavier had said. Gold-eyed and broad-shouldered and entirely at ease, the body and the face of a man who had no idea he was being seen. Not the face he put on for rooms. Not the managed one. The one he wore when he thought no one was looking. She watched him for a long time. She was not looking at the man she had fallen in love with. She was not looking at the man who had pulled a chair across from her in a document hall and asked her to walk him through her thinking, and genuinely meant it. She was looking at the man she had been living beside, and she understood, finally, completely, with no part of her reaching to soften the understanding or give it a more manageable shape, that those had been 2 different people for a while now. She had simply kept choosing to see only one of them. She turned away from the window. She had grieved before. Quietly, in small amounts, over 3 years of corridors where her work received his applause, and she stood just outside it. 3 years of small erosions, each one survivable on its own, each one placed in that quiet interior place. What she felt now was not grief. The grief was already done, already behind her, accumulated in slow increments across 3 years of small rooms. What she felt now was clarity, complete, absolute clarity. The specific kind that comes when every remaining door has been closed from the outside and only one direction is still open. She turned away from the window. She went back to her desk. She opened a fresh sheet of correspondence paper, and she began. There were 18 days between finding that letter and the night of the winter solstice gathering. No one knew this. That was the entire point. During those 18 days, Elatara attended every social event without a single outward change. She smiled at the right people. She said the right things. She appeared to every eye in Ironvale Keep to be exactly the Luna she had always been. Gracious, present, a little quiet, the kind of woman who occupies the soft edges of rooms and never pushes toward the center. She had been practicing this presentation for 3 years. She was exceptional at it now, and what had once been a performance of survival was now, for the first time, a performance with a purpose. Inside, she was working. The first matter was the gate. The side gate off the east corridor had been stiff for 2 months. The latch was worn, not broken, just slow, the kind of mechanical failure that everyone intends to fix, and no one prioritizes. In her weekly household maintenance report, delivered with her usual quiet precision, Elira noted it. A worn latch on the east passage gate. A safety concern if it failed entirely during a large gathering. She recommended repair. The request sat in a queue behind 14 more urgent items. Elira did not follow up. Over the following 3 weeks, she made 3 visits to the Keep's formal archive. Entirely routine, the kind she made regularly as part of her correspondence work. No one thought twice about it. On the 3rd visit, she withdrew the original working copy of the Silver Peak Accord. The Silver Peak Accord was what the Council called Aelor's greatest achievement. It had ended a multi-season border dispute and established shared territorial rights with 2 neighboring pacts. Elder Zorian had used the word extraordinary at least 4 times in the Council session following its signing. The working document, the original one, the one that showed the actual thinking, the negotiating process, the 3 alternative boundary lines that had been considered and rejected, the margin notes explaining every decision, was written entirely in Elira's handwriting. From the first line to the last, her working notes in the margins. Her signature at the bottom, not because she had intended to formalize it, but because she always signed her own work, even in the drafts no one was ever meant to see. She replaced it in the archive with a clean copy, perfectly accurate, correctly formatted, every clause in its proper place. Aelor's name exactly where the formal record expected it. The copy was indistinguishable from the original unless you needed something specific that only the original contained. The original went into Ava's traveling trunk, tucked beneath a small wool blanket. On the 10th day, she wrote to Lorcan Stormvale. The letter addressed a genuine ongoing border question. There was always a genuine question along the Western Reach boundary, and Elira had been managing this correspondence as part of her regular work for nearly 2 years. She wrote in the Keep's formal, lunar style, precise and professionally appropriate, using the diplomatic language that she and Lorcan had been building across 16 months of shared letters. Careful, layered language, the kind that had a surface conversation, and, for anyone who had been reading closely enough and long enough, a second one underneath it. She had known for some time that Lorcan was reading both. She had not yet been willing to write to the second one directly. Now she did. Carefully. Nested inside the border question so precisely that it would read as standard correspondence to any outside eye. But to the one person who had been inside this exchange long enough to recognize how her arguments were structured beneath the formal surface, to the person who had been engaging with the second conversation for months without either of them naming it, the question was entirely clear. She asked for help. She asked for a way out. She asked for a place where her name would be on her own work, and her daughter would be safe, and she could stop performing her own invisibility as a survival strategy. She asked without sentimentality, the way she asked for everything that mattered, precisely, with the full weight of what she meant, carried in the structure of the argument, rather than the emotional register of the words. Lorcan's response arrived in 9 days. It was a diplomatic letter, formally correct, addressing the border question with his usual measured precision. But near the close, in a passage that was technically about the proposed boundary alignment and was, to the two people who had been corresponding for 16 months, about something else entirely, was a paragraph of such complete, careful welcome that she had to set it down and sit with the window for a moment before she could continue. She read it twice. She folded it exactly. She allowed herself one full breath. Then she went back to work. On the 15th day, she brought Narelle to the document room. Narelle Ashbourne had been at Elira's side since the first month of the bond. She was not a woman who spoke unless speech was necessary, and in 3 years she had never once asked a question she didn't genuinely need the answer to. She had the settled, quiet certainty of someone who decided a long time ago which side of a situation she was on, and had no interest in revisiting that decision every time circumstances shifted. Elira gave her 3 questions: the departure schedule for the solstice gathering's formal guests, the guard rotation along the east side of the keep during the gathering, whether the east corridor window could be seen from the garden path at night. Narelle answered each one without hesitation. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at the candle between them on the table. "How long do we have?" she asked. Elira told her. 18 days until the gathering, the departure window on that night. Narelle looked at her steadily. 3 years of side by side, and not one unnecessary question in any of it. "I am coming with you," she said. Elira's voice was gentle and completely without negotiation. "Not yet. I will send for you the moment it's safe. I promise you that." Narelle held her gaze for a moment. Then she reached across the table and moved the candle a little closer to Elira's side. Just that. The small and entirely practical gesture of a woman who had decided that if she could not go tonight, she would at least make sure the light was where it needed to be. She nodded. She rose. She left. Elira sat alone in the document room with the better light, and thought, for the first time without immediately stopping herself, about Lorcan Stormvale. She knew him through letters, which meant she knew him in the specific and surprisingly deep way you know someone when the only access you have is their written thinking. He was precise. He was fair. He had a quality she had noticed from the very beginning of their correspondence. He listened. Not just to the argument on the surface, to the mind that made it, to the reasoning underneath the conclusion, to the questions that weren't asked directly, but that shaped every line of the letter. 6 months ago, near the close of a letter about waterway access rights that had nothing unusual about it, he had included a single sentence that had nothing to do with the border matter. The logic in your last letter on the boundary question is the clearest territorial reasoning I have encountered in 8 years of correspondence. I find myself curious who advises you. She had written back. The same person who always has. He had not replied to that line directly, but every letter since had engaged with her arguments more fully, with a quality of attention that had shifted from professional precision to something that felt less like engagement and more like recognition, like someone adjusting to a light that had been there all along. She did not name what she felt when she thought about it. Not yet. She let it exist in the warm, working space of the present without demanding it become anything specific. The carriage arrangements were made through a contract with Orvan, a driver of many years and famously little curiosity, whose professional identity was built on the principle that a man who asked no questions kept all his clients. The arrangement was simple. the carriage would be on the back road off the East Passage at a specified time on the night of the solstice gathering. He would wait. He would drive west. 18 days. One piece at a time. One step, then the next. The same method she had used to build everything else worth building in her life. The winter solstice gathering arrived the way things arrive when you have been counting toward them for a long time. Suddenly, and then immediately real. The great hall had been transformed. 400 candles. The drums already running their deep pulse through stone and floor and chest. The long tables loaded with abundance. The kind of display that turns provision into statement. We are prosperous. We are strong. We are a people who celebrate without hesitation because we believe tomorrow will look exactly like today. Aelor Ironvale was at the head of his hall in midnight black, gold-eyed, at ease in the warm certainty of a man whose world has always accommodated him. Soraya Blackthorn was at his right hand, deliberate red, already wearing the space beside him, with the ease of someone who has measured the distance and decided it fits. Elira arrived 40 minutes after the doors opened. She wore dark silver. Not elaborate, not ceremonial. The deliberate choice of someone who wants to read as present, gracious, and entirely ordinary. She had been making this choice for 3 years. She was very good at it. She moved through the hall with the ease of someone who had learned every face, every social territory, every unspoken arrangement in this room over 3 years of attending it. She spoke to Elder Zorian's wife about the seasonal floral arrangements and the late delivery of the winter greenery from the northern suppliers. She thanked the Coldbrook delegation's senior envoy for his patience on the ongoing river access correspondence, a matter she had been managing for 4 months and had nearly resolved. She accepted a cup of something warm from a passing server and held it in a way that suggested she was drinking from it. She looked at Aelor once. He was laughing at something Soraya had said, the corner of his mouth lifted in the genuinely amused way. The real one, not the performed one. The one Elira recognized because she had made him look that way herself on nights that felt now like they had happened to someone she no longer was. He did not look back at her. She looked away. That was the last time. She spent the next hour being exactly who this room expected her to be. Gracious, present, warm, unremarkable in the specific way she had cultivated over 3 years. The kind of unremarkable that makes a room comfortable, that allows people to stop looking because they have decided they already know what they'll see. She spoke to the people she needed to speak to. She said what needed to be said. She smiled at the right moments with the ease of someone for whom this particular performance requires no effort at all anymore, because it has been practiced into something automatic. Then she pressed 2 fingers lightly to her left temple. Elder Zorian's wife noticed immediately. She was a genuinely kind woman who had developed, over 3 years of observation, a protective instinct toward Elira's health. "You look pale," she said. "Are you well?" "A low fever," Elira said, keeping her voice soft and apologetic. "It's been building since morning. I am so sorry. I don't think I can stay." The concern was immediate and entirely real. No one questioned it. Her early departures from large gatherings were one of the most reliable features of life at Ironvale Keep. She was simply that kind of woman, sensitive to crowds, easily overwhelmed. The pack had learned to expect it and make space for it. That was what 3 years of invisible competence had purchased, among other things, the ability to leave a room full of witnesses and have no one notice the weight of what was under her arm. She said her quiet goodbyes. She retrieved Ava from her nurse, sleeping, warm, heavy, with the boneless weight of a small child, deep in uncomplicated rest. Ava did not wake. She simply arrived against Elira's shoulder and held on, her small hand closing around the front of Elira's cloak with the automatic grip of someone who trusts completely without thinking about it. Elira walked toward the corridor. She did not look at the great hall as she passed. She did not look for Aelor's silhouette at the head of his table. There was nothing behind her that she hadn't already, in some quiet room over the past 18 days, said goodbye to. The east corridor was cold. Stone cold. The kind of cold that has never expected to be anything else. She moved through it without hesitation. Left at the portrait hall, down the back stair, through the cold larder passage, into the east corridor proper. Halfway down the back stair, she heard footsteps. She went completely still. Ava breathed against her shoulder. The small hand held on. Kitchen staff. She could tell by the direction and the pace, functional, unhurried, going left toward the serving prep area. Not right, not toward her. She waited. 1 full minute of silence, counted with care. Then she moved. The east gate latch gave without resistance. She stepped through into the cold night air. Behind her, through the thick stone walls, the feast was still burning. She could feel the drums through the stone, through the ground, through the soles of her feet. She could not hear Aelor's voice from this distance. The walls were too thick. But she knew it was there, and she knew what it sounded like, and she did not need to hear it one more time. The garden path, the hedgerow, the back road in the dark. Orvan was there. The carriage sat in the shadow of the old oak line, and he was sitting up top with the complete expressionlessness of a man who has been paid well and intends to be worth every coin of it. He saw her. He opened the carriage door without a word. She stepped in. She settled Ava against her chest. The small hand found her cloak again, without searching. Complete, unquestioning trust. The carriage moved west. Through the small side window, Elira watched Ironvale Keep's windows burning gold against the black night. 400 candles. The shadow shapes of celebrating people moving behind the glass. The sound, muffled by distance now, of a world she had built, celebrating, with no understanding yet of what was already beginning to come apart. The road curved, the tree line rose, the light narrowed. She looked away before the last of it disappeared. Deliberately. The same careful way she had spent 3 years learning to look away from things that were taking more than she had decided to give. Ava shifted. Elira held her closer. She took a slow, long breath, the kind you cannot take when you are always slightly braced, always performing, always managing. The first breath in 18 days that was entirely her own. The keep disappeared behind the tree line. She did not look back for it. Aelor Ironvale woke the morning after the winter solstice gathering with the comfortable, uncomplicated heaviness of a man who has eaten well, slept soundly, and has no particular reason to believe today will look different from any day before it. He called for his morning council brief, the organized, annotated summary of overnight correspondence and the day's priorities. The thing that had been waiting on his study desk every morning for 2.5 years. Compiled before he woke, ready when he arrived. His aide came back empty-handed. The desk was bare. He filed it under Elira, having been unwell the night before, and moved on. He took his morning meal. He trained with his lieutenants in the yard. He returned mid-morning to the study to find his aide waiting in the corridor, with the expression of a man who has been building toward a sentence and has not yet found the right first word. The Luna's chambers are empty, his aide said. "The child is not in the nursery." Aylor looked at him. "She's somewhere in the keep," he said. "Check the document room." She was not in the document room. She was not in the library, the archive, the record hall, the solarium, or any other room anyone thought to check. Narelle said only that she did not know when the Luna had left, and said it with the complete composure of a woman who had made her decision 3 years ago about where her loyalty lived, and was not going to revisit it because the room was getting uncomfortable. By midday, Xavian had compiled a report, 3 items missing from the keep's holdings, a document from the Eastern Archive, a letter from the Luna's personal correspondence files, a traveling trunk from private storage. Aylor reviewed the document chest himself. Everything was in order, every treaty present, every piece of correspondence filed correctly. He went through it twice. He found nothing obviously wrong. He did not know yet what was gone, because what was gone had been replaced with such precision that its absence was invisible from the outside. You could only find the gap if you knew what you were looking for and reached for it with a specific need it could not meet. He did not know to look yet. 5 days after the solstice gathering, a territorial dispute from the Grimwood Pack required the foundational document of the Silver Peak Accord, specifically the preliminary working document that showed the negotiating logic behind the territorial concessions and the reasoning for each boundary decision. Xavian retrieved the archive copy. It was complete, accurately formatted, every clause in its proper place. The Grimwood envoy, seated across the formal table, asked Aylor to explain the reasoning behind the Eastern Waterway Clause, specifically why that particular boundary line and not the 3 alternatives that had evidently been considered during the preliminary negotiations. Aylor opened the document. The explanation was not there. The clean copy showed the decisions. It did not show how they had been reached, or what alternatives had been weighed, or the reasoning that had discarded those alternatives in favor of the line that was chosen. That was in the original working document, the one with the margin notes, the one in Elira's handwriting. He went to his memory. The explanation was not there either, because he had never built it. He had sat at the final signing table. He had received the finished document and added his name to it. He had never read the working papers. He had not known they existed. He used the right words at the table. He had 20 years of authority to draw from, and authority is very good at occupying spaces where understanding should be. He spoke with confidence. He sounded like a man who knew what he was discussing. He bought himself a week to produce the full documentation. He dismissed the session. He walked out of the war room. He sat alone in his study afterward. Not shouting. Not blaming Elira for anything yet. Not blaming anyone yet. Simply sitting very still in a room full of things he had been credited with building, feeling for the first time the exact shape of the hollow beneath his feet. He went looking for anything that would help him reconstruct the treaty logic. He went to the diplomatic archive. He pulled the full Silver Peak correspondence, the external exchange files, the border letters from the period of the negotiation. He found the Lorcan Stormveil thread, 16 months of regular correspondence under the Ironveil Lunar seal. He began to read. He recognized Elira's intelligence in the first 3 paragraphs. He recognized the structure, the way each letter anticipated the response it would receive and positioned itself accordingly. He would know this thinking anywhere. He had been in a room with it. He had asked it questions across a document hall table at midnight and stayed 2 hours because he did not want to stop. But the letters with Lorcan were different from the ones under the official pack correspondence, different in a quality he felt before he could name. A fullness, an extension, the specific quality of a mind that has found another mind on the other side of the page that is genuinely keeping up and responded with everything it actually had. He read deeper. 8 months back, near the close of a letter about a proposed boundary alignment, a letter technically about geography, and about something else entirely to anyone inside the correspondence long enough to recognize it, Lorcan had written a paragraph of such careful, complete recognition that Aylor set it down and looked at the wall for a long time. He had been signing letters in this correspondence for over a year. He had authorized Elira to manage the Western Reach Exchange as part of her normal work, and had never once sat down and read the full thread. He had not known the second conversation existed. He did not know even now what had passed between them beneath the formal surface. He only knew that whatever Elira had built in those letters, she had built it while he was standing in halls being credited for her foundations. She had not left in desperation. She had not run into uncertainty. She had walked into something she had already carefully built with someone who had learned, long before she was ready to be found, to recognize exactly who she was. He sat in the archive corridor for a long time, not performing anything. There was no one to perform for. There was nothing to manage. He thought about the morning in the early light. 2 cups of tea, the quiet hour of parallel work in a room that didn't need any space filled, the moment he had chosen to sit across from her rather than summon her to him, the version of himself who had meant every question he asked. He thought about Elder Zorion's voice saying, "Your instincts were remarkable." He thought about his hand on the back of her chair, his shoulders squaring to receive the commendation. The correction that never came. He thought about 4 words in his own handwriting, written with a pen he still kept in the left-hand drawer of his desk. Begin the process quietly. He understood, finally, what he had done. Not in the abstract way of someone cataloguing failures from a safe distance. He understood it in the body, the way you understand something that arrives as weight before it arrives as words. He had taken the most valuable thing in his world and treated it the way you treat something you believe will always be there, without counting what it was giving, without asking what it was costing, not with cruelty, with comfort. And comfort, in the end, had done more damage than cruelty could have, because comfort does not know it is making a choice. He sat in the archive corridor and felt the full dimension of the hollow he had been standing over for 3 years. It was very large. Aylor's formal request for a meeting arrived at the Western Reach 6 weeks after Xavion's intelligence report. Elira read it at her desk in the morning, with Ava at the small corner table applying careful and thorough concentration to her porridge. She sat with the letter for a long time. She read it twice. She set it down. Then she wrote her response. The meeting would be at the Western Reach's neutral border hall. On her timeline, she would bring the document. She sent the reply the same morning and went back to her work. Because there was a great deal of work here, and all of it had her name on it. The Western Reach had become, over the past 2 months, the thing she hadn't known she was looking for. Not a refuge. She had not fled to safety. She had walked toward something she had built, and the thing she had built was simply a place where she was allowed to be entirely herself. Her name appeared on every document her thinking produced. Letters went out under her name. When someone in council referred to a piece of analysis, they referred back to its author. When an assessment proved correct, the record showed whose assessment it was. The first time she saw her own name in print on a formal correspondence going out into the world, not a draft, not a working copy, but the actual letter, her actual name as the actual author. She sat with it for a full minute before she picked up her pen. She did not cry. She simply held the moment. The way you hold something that has been missing long enough that finding it produces not simple relief, but a deep and startled recognition. Her name, on her work, going out into the world to do what it was built to do. She picked up her pen and kept writing. The Western Alliance Council had received her with careful interest, and after 2 weeks of direct observation, with something closer to open respect. She was a named senior advisor. Her assessments went under her name. Her authority was acknowledged in the room where decisions were made, not in the corridor outside it. And then there was Lorcan. She had known him through letters for 2 years. Knowing him in person was a different experience, and it was different in a way she had not expected. There was no adjustment to make. The man in the letters and the man in the room were entirely consistent, which meant that what she had come to understand about him through 16 months of careful correspondence was accurate. He was exactly as precise, as fair, and as attentive as the letters had indicated. He did not declare anything. He did not make speeches. He simply acted in accordance with what he had decided he valued and did not require acknowledgement for the acting. A dense volume on Western territorial history appeared outside her study door one morning with no note. She read it in a day and a half, absorbed from the first chapter, returning to passages that connected to questions she had been turning over for months. She sent it back with 4 pages of her own notes tucked inside, small-lettered, precise, occasionally dry in the specific way of someone who uses humor only when the moment genuinely calls for it. He read those notes. She could tell from the way he engaged with her in the council meeting 2 days later, addressing her arguments at a depth that only someone who had read carefully would reach. He did not tell her he had read them. He simply demonstrated it. A shared meal that began as a border discussion ran 3 hours past the point where all the business was finished. Neither of them reached for the ending. The conversation moved from the current boundary question to the history of the waterway rights framework, to a question she had been holding for months about the ethics of silence in formal diplomacy. And he had thoughts. She had more thoughts. They did not agree on all of it. The disagreement was the best part. An evening reviewing the same stack of boundary documents, going through them in parallel from different sides of the table, they arrived at the same conclusion at the same moment. The recognition in the look that passed between them across the table. Not surprised that they agreed, but the specific, warm recognition of 2 minds that have been working alongside each other long enough to begin moving in the same direction without coordination. He did not declare anything after that moment. He did not name it. He simply continued doing what he had been doing from the beginning, ensuring that everywhere her thinking went, her name went with it. She understood what this was. She understood it completely and without any ambiguity, because she knew, with bone-deep precision, exactly what its absence had looked like for 3 years. She let it be there, in the warm, working light of the Western Reach, without forcing it into a shape before it was ready to hold one, and her daughter slept well in the next room, every night, and the letters went out with her name on them, and the work was hers. The neutral border hall was cold and clear the morning of the meeting. Stone walls, high windows that let in sharp winter light without any warmth behind it. A long, plain table, the kind that has no interest in making an impression. 2 chairs across from each other. Elira arrived in travelling silver. Not the same piece as the night she left Iron Vale, but the same choice. Deliberate. The colour of a woman who requires nothing from the room around her to confirm who she is. Ava's hand was in hers. Ava was wearing her good wool coat and was deeply occupied with the carved stone moon in the ceiling, which she had apparently decided required careful study. The leather document case was under Elira's other arm. She sat down across from Aelor Ironvale. He looked different. Not older. Changed in the interior way, as if something had been removed that used to occupy space behind his eyes. The easy, unearned certainty that used to enter rooms ahead of him was quieter now, worn down by the specific gravity of a man who has finally stood still long enough to feel what the ground beneath him is made of, and found it hollow. He looked at her across the table. She looked back. A moment of silence that belonged equally to both of them. Not tense, just honest. The first honest silence they had shared in longer than she could accurately measure. "Come back," he said, not performed, just said, quietly. "Let me correct this, all of it. The work, I will acknowledge every piece of it, publicly, before the pack and before the council. I understand now what I failed to see." He meant it. She could see that he meant it in the full, unguarded sincerity of a man who has finally arrived at a reckoning and is standing in it. 3 years ago, she would have held that expression and let the sincerity of the moment carry more weight than the pattern of the years. She would have wanted the real version of him to win badly enough to help it along with everything she had. She did not do that now. She looked at him with the stillness of a woman who has already sat with the loss of this man in quiet rooms, who had been grieving him in slow, private increments across 3 years of small erasures, long before she sat across from him in this one. A woman who had finished her grieving somewhere on a road, moving west through the dark, with her daughter sleeping against her shoulder, and had arrived here already complete. "You kept asking me to love you more than you were willing to love me back," she said. "I did that for 3 years. I am not going to do it again." She lifted the silver pica cord from the document case and set it on the table between them. Her handwriting, from the first word to the last, every page, the preliminary framework, the negotiating logic, the 3 alternative boundary lines, and the reasoning for discarding each one, the final concessions, and the specific arguments that had produced them. Her working notes in every margin, small and precise, in the hand he had watched working across from him in a document hall at midnight and asked to walk him through. Her signature at the bottom of the final page, the original, the only version that showed how it had actually been done. "Every piece the council celebrated as your greatest achievement," she said. "I built it. Every letter that kept your alliances breathing, I wrote it. Every summit that went smoothly, I had already prepared the ground before you sat down. This pack has been standing on my work with no name on the floor, and I have no interest in returning to be the invisible foundation of a house that never once looked down to ask who was holding it up." She stood. She picked up Ava, who came to her without hesitation, settled against her shoulder with the absolute trust of a child who has never had any reason to do otherwise, one small hand closing around the front of Elira's traveling cloak. Ava looked at Aelor from her mother's shoulder with the direct, assessing gaze of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned to manage her attention for anyone's comfort. Elira walked to the door. She did not look back. Not as a statement. Not to prove a point. Not because she was performing a kind of strength for the room. Because there was genuinely nothing behind her that she hadn't already finished looking at. She had said goodbye to all of this. To the hope of this. To the grief of this. To the last version of him she had ever been willing to reach for. In small, private moment. Across 3 years of quiet rooms. long before she sat across from him in this one. The cold western air met her on the other side of the door, sharp, clean, entirely in front of her. She walked into it. That evening, Elira Silvercrest sat at her desk in the Western Reach. The lamp was burning, steady, warm, the kind of light that asks nothing of the person it illuminates and takes nothing back. A border proposal was open in front of her, almost finished. One more paragraph to complete before it would be ready for the morning dispatch. Her name was at the top of the page, in clean ink, the same place it had been on every document she had produced since arriving here. In the next room, Ava was asleep. She could hear her through the open door, soft, even breathing, the completely uncomplicated breathing of a child who has no unfinished business with the world. No tension carried into sleep, no weight held in small shoulders. Just rest, deep and simple, the breathing of a child who is entirely safe and does not need to think about it. Elira looked at the page in front of her. Her name, the lamp, the quiet room, the proposal she had built from its beginning, carrying the full weight of her actual thinking. Nothing softened for a room, nothing redirected for someone else's credit, nothing designed to be invisible. A soft knock at the door. She knew it was Lorcan before he spoke. He did this in the evenings, a quiet presence just outside the door, no pressure behind it, no expectation underneath it. Just the simple willingness of someone who has decided that being nearby when a person might need something is worth more than waiting to be invited. She had told him twice it wasn't necessary. He had continued, not because he hadn't heard her, but because for him it had never been about necessity. It was simply what you did when someone's work mattered to you, and they were doing it late by lamplight, and the tea was already made. "Still working," she said. She was smiling. Not the one she had kept ready for 3 years of public rooms and pack gatherings, and all the long work of being gracious in spaces that were not hers. Not the managed one, the other one, the real one, the one that is simply a feeling, with nothing calculated resting anywhere on top of it. Almost done. A brief pause, the warm kind. "Tea is ready when you are." His footsteps moved away from the door without a sound of waiting or checking. No pressure behind them. No need to be thanked or noticed for the offering. She sat for a moment longer in the lamplight, her name at the top of the page, the border proposal almost complete, her daughter breathing peacefully in the next room, a man down the hall who had learned to love her through letters, who had recognized, long before she was ready to name it, exactly who she was, and who demonstrated that recognition every day, not with speeches, but with the simple, consistent act of ensuring that her name appeared on every page her thinking touched. Somewhere far to the south, across the border, a man was sitting in a hall built on invisible labor, holding a document that proved the labor existed. He had the original now. He had a choice to make, correct the record or carry the debt. That was his work to do. She had left it with him. Here in the Western Reach, the lamp burned on. She picked up a pen. She wrote the final paragraph of the proposal in the clean, unhurried hand of someone who has time, for once, to let the thinking arrive at its own pace. She reached the last line. She wrote it. She set the pen down. She read it back once. It was good. It was exactly what she had meant. She signed her name at the bottom. Then she rose and went to get the tea. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not walk into rooms and demand recognition. It does not stand at the head of the table and accept the commendation. It simply works. It builds. It holds things up. It writes the letters and designs the peace and maintains the alliances and raises the child and starts again the next morning. For 3 years, Elira Silvercrest's strength held an entire world together. And that world looked at her and saw a quiet woman at the soft edge of the room. They were wrong. She did not leave in anger. She left in clarity, the specific, absolute clarity of a woman who had finished asking a question she already knew the answer to, and had finally decided that knowing the answer was reason enough to act on it. She did not take revenge. She took what was hers, her daughter, her work, her name, and the road west. She did not burn the world that had tried to make her invisible. She simply stepped out of it. And somewhere in the Western Reach, at a desk in lamplight, with a proposal finished, and her name at the bottom and her daughter breathing softly in the next room, and warm tea waiting by the door, a woman who was always extraordinary finally gets to be exactly that, with her name on every page. Her daughter safe in the next room, and a man down the hall who brings tea not because she asked, but because he decided, quietly and without drama, that her work is worth making warm. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for someone to see them. Elira Silvercrest stopped waiting, and in the stopping, she found the only thing that matters in the end, herself, complete, undiminished, entirely hers. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something real in one of these chapters, leave a comment below. Tell us, which moment hit you the hardest? Subscribe for more stories like this one, released every week. And if you know someone who needs to hear about a woman who stopped being invisible and walked into the life she had already quietly built, share this with them. She built everything in silence. The least we can do is say her name out loud. There was a gathering in the second winter of the bond where Elira understood something she had not been able to name before. It was not a large gathering, a mid-season council dinner, the kind held for internal pack business, and the welcoming of 2 new senior advisors to the Iron Vale table. 12 people. 1 long table. The particular intimacy of a small formal room where everyone can hear every conversation. Elira had spent 3 days preparing the background material for the new advisors. 2 dense briefing documents covering the pack's current territorial standing, the open correspondence threads with neighboring packs, the 3 diplomatic priorities Aelor had been navigating for the better part of a year. She had written them the way she wrote everything, precisely, with the logic visible, with nothing softened or simplified that did not need to be. The dinner was straightforward. The advisors were welcomed. The documents she had prepared were distributed. One of the new advisors, a sharp-featured man named Callan Frostvale, brought in for his expertise in Eastern boundary law, looked up from the briefing packet halfway through the first course and said, "This is exceptional groundwork. The analysis in the second section alone is... Whoever prepared this understands the Grimwood situation better than the Grimwood pack understands it themselves." He said it to the table in general. Aelor said, "The keep produces thorough work." Callan Frostvale looked at the document, then at Aelor, then around the table, as if looking for someone to direct the specific compliment toward. He found no one, because the person who should have been found was sitting 3 chairs down from him, and had not been introduced in any capacity that would make the connection legible. Elira smiled at Elder Zorion's wife about something across the table. She kept smiling. It was not difficult. She had been keeping that particular smile available for a long time. Later, in the corridor after the dinner, Aelor fell into step beside her. He was in a good mood. The advisors had been well received. The evening had gone smoothly. The pack's position looked strong. He said, "You were quiet tonight." She said, "I usually am." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. Something passed between them that was not quite a question and not quite an answer, but that both of them understood perfectly. He did not name it. She did not name it. They walked back to their chambers in the particular quiet of two people who have agreed, without discussing it, not to open a specific door tonight. She lay awake after he was asleep, in the dark, and held that moment, the one at the table when Callan Frostvale had looked for someone to credit and found no one, and placed it carefully in the small interior space where she was keeping everything she was not yet ready to examine. It was getting crowded in there. She told herself it was a small thing. She believed it because she needed to, because she had chosen this man and this life, and she was not yet ready to let the accumulation of small things outweigh the weight of that choosing. But small things compound. She would not understand how much they had compounded until she stood at a window in Aylor's study, with a folded letter in her hands, and the clarity arrived, final and complete, that 3 years of small things had built something that could no longer be called small.